Welcome to another video on file handling using Python. In the previous lecture, we had discussed what are files in Python. We had gone through various ways of creating a file or writing to a file, and we had seen a number of constraints while we are trying to write to a file. Now, what we are going to do is we are going to move on to the next popular file handling operation, which is reading a file. So, the natural thing to do, you understand, is that after we have written to a file, we would want to access the contents of the file. And how do we do that? In order to access the contents of the file, we will be reading from the file. And like we had seen in the previous video, before we start writing to a file, the first thing that we need to do is we need to open the file. By opening the file, what we do is we establish a link between the file which exists on our secondary memory and the Python object that we are trying to create. And that is exactly what we are going to do when we are trying to read a file as well. So if we concentrate on this first line of code, what we are trying to do here is we are trying to establish a link between our file. The file exists under D drive within a subfolder called my subfolder. The name of the file is file to be read. Like we had seen previously, here also the extension of the file .txt is mandatory if we are trying to access a file using Python code. And the processing mode, which in this case is R is short for read mode, is also strongly recommended. We do not leave it to the defaults. So here what we are doing is, with the help of the open function, we are establishing a link between a file pointer variable called fobj and the actual file on our secondary memory, which is called file to be read.txt. Now, once this link is established, what we want to do is we would want to read from the file. So in order to read from the file, we'll be using the read function. We'll be calling the read function on the file pointer variable with which the file has been linked, which in this case is fobj. And lastly, what we can do is we can print the contents of the file. And after we are done printing the contents of the file, we could simply close the file, which is once again strongly recommended. As I had discussed in the previous video, we'll not rely on the Python environment to close our files. For closing our files, we'll do them explicitly using the close method by calling the close method on the file pointer object. So if we go to our subfolder, here is the file to be read. If we open this up, this is what the file looks like. We are reading, there are two lines of text. We are reading from this file. This file contains two lines of content. Let's see if our program or if our code snippet manages to retrieve this content from the file. So I'll be closing the notepad, and if I go back, if I try to execute this cell, yes, we have managed to do it successfully. So once again, if I could show you the contents, this is file to be read. If I open up the code, yes, now if we compare, we find that yes, the read operation is successful. What we have managed to read using Python code is exactly the same as the contents of the file. So that is how we go about reading from a file. And the key takeaways from this code snippet is, firstly, to read a file, we'll be using the R processing mode. R is short for the read operation. Now remember, reading a file will not alter the contents of the file. That is very important. It's not that because I am retrieving contents of a file, because I am reading from a file, the contents of the file gets changed. No, the contents of the file remains intact. And we just saw that when I opened up the notepad and showed you the contents of the file. After the read operation was performed, the contents were exactly the same. The contents did not alter. So reading a file will never alter the contents of the file. And the last thing is, regardless of the contents of the file, regardless of the content being text or numbers, Python will always treat the contents of a text file as one complete string, which is why we were able to read this file. We were able to read the contents of the file, the entire contents, in a string called content of file, and then we managed to display the contents as well. So that was about reading a file. The next operation that I would like to introduce you to is appending to a file. So what do you mean by the append operation? Append operation means you already have an existing file. The file contains contents. It may not contain contents either. So it may be an empty file as well. In either case, what you want to do is you want to add more content. You want to append more content at the end of the file. That is the objective of the append operation. Usually, you would not be performing the append operation on an empty file, but even if you do, the contents would get added to the file. That won't be a problem. We usually append to a file which has some contents inside it, and that is exactly what we are trying to do here. The mode in this case will change to A. So for the write operation, we had seen the W mode. For the read operation, we had looked at the R mode. And now we are staring at the A mode for append operation. Once again, we are specifying the absolute path, the complete path from which we want to access the file. And what we want to do is we want to append contents to this file. And what is the content? This is the content, the text. I have highlighted it for you. And remember, in order to append to a file, we don't have a separate function called append. We'll be taking help of the write method in order to perform the append operation. So how will the system know that we are appending or writing? Because if I write to a file, then we have seen earlier, the contents get erased completely. The system will understand this when it looks at the call to the open function. So when we call the open function and we specify the processing mode, which in this case is A, what happens is we tell the Python environment that look, I want to append to this file. I don't want to write to the file. You may look at a call to a write method later on, but don't get confused. Look at the processing mode. I'm trying to append to a file. I'm not trying to write to a file. So by looking at the processing mode, the Python environment would understand that all right, the user is not trying to rewrite the contents of the file. The user is trying to keep the current contents intact and write new contents at the end of the file. Append new contents at the end of the file. So that is how it understands things. And if you remember, we had discussed this in the previous video that the write function will not append a new line at the end. That is why before placing the content, before placing the new content in our file, we are appending a or we are prefixing the content with a new line character so that this new line of text is added at the end of the file on a new line and not on the same line as the existing content. So if we execute this and now if we open up our file, so file to be read, there you have it. If we compare, if you look at it, so what has happened here? We have managed to add new contents to our file. So these two lines already existed. And now we have added a new line, which is the one that I've highlighted. So this is how we can append to a file. And it's important to note this in mind that if we do not use a new line, the new content will get appended from the previous line, isn't it? So once again, if we try to perform the append operation on the same file, but the text that we want to append, this is the text that we are trying to append. This text this time is not prefixed by any new line character like it was in the previous case. In the previous case, we had prefixed a new line character, but in this case we are not prefixing a new line character. So what would happen is it would look clumsy and that this new line of text would get added exactly at the point where the existing content ends. So if we execute this and if we again open up the file, there you have it. And you see the new line, the new line that we have just appended, sorry, the new line that we have just appended starts exactly from the point where the existing content ended. So this is something that we have to be careful about, that we want to append in such a way that the content of the file is not clumsy and we are easily able to work with the file later on. In the next video, we'll see a few more operations related to files. And till then, you please go through the content. If you have any doubts, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. Thank you for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.